ladies and gentlemen, over the last couple of days, we've spoken a lot about learning to learn, and there are things that we've just discussed now, coexisting in our changing world and co-creating knowledge societies. And these are really things that our next two speakers have adopted in their everyday life and their work. So if you could please welcome on stage the award-winning novelist, Ms. Chimamanda Adichie, and Stavros Yanuka, the CEO of WISE, for the next session. So first of all, how remarkable is Patrick? Can I just say, I'd like to...
He is beyond remarkable. And can I just say that I feel a particular sense of pride because he's my brother. He's my West African brother.
Of course, and we've got another brilliant African here on the stage. I mean, you often speak about the complexities of people, and that every single person has a different story. And I suppose in many ways, we've spoken a lot in the last few days about how the education system needs to change to fit into the fact that people are learning in different ways. And Patrick's touched on that as well. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about, you speak about how complex people are and how they learn in different ways.
I've also found myself thinking a lot about education because I have a baby. Well, she's 2, so she's maybe not so much of a baby now, and thinking about how important it is for me that she learns as she plays. And so it kind of makes me think about how learning should be fun, but also how it shouldn't always be fun. How we should make room, maybe 20% of learning shouldn't be fun. And I say this as somebody who completely hated mathematics when I was in secondary school. And had I been given the choice, I would not have taken mathematics, but I'm happy that I was made to take it because it helps me be able to calculate my change when I go to the market. but really, just in a larger, and I think it's important that we think of education in a very broad sense and that we acknowledge the diversity of people. And I say this as a person who was educated in Nigeria, primary school and secondary school, started studying medicine in Nigeria, and then left to go to the US because I didn't want to become a doctor. And looking back now, I wish that I had been allowed to, for example, take classes in what was known as the arts. And so it was a very rigid system. There was the sciences and then the arts. And if you did well in school, you went to the sciences. And there was an ever so slight tinge of about the arts that they were somehow less than, that it was what people did who weren't very bright. And I think that's such a dangerous thing because it limits students. I was very much interested in history and in literature, and I wanted to take classes in music and history, and I couldn't. Because they said, you're bright, so you go to the sciences. And so I wish that education, that the systems would be more flexible, that they acknowledge that it is in fact possible to like chemistry and music. So that's kind of that's my dream for education systems across the continent of Africa.
Stavros, is there room now for change? Because a lot of educational institutes are very rigid and, Chimamanda just spoke about needing flexibility in that.
Well, I absolutely agree, and I think there's tremendous room for change. I mean, WISE is predicated on change. That's why we have innovation in our DNA, in our title. And if you look around the WISE community, you see many examples of people trying to do things differently. Just over the last 2 days, people may have come across Ben Nelson and the Minerva School, or Minerva University, I should say, which is reimagining how you do higher education without a campus. Minerva, for those who don't know, has established itself as a liberal arts university without a campus. It just moves students from across 6 or 7 different cities, and they use the city as the classroom. They have faculty, they use the technology to connect. There's a cohort, they use the city as the classroom. Patrick is doing incredible stuff. I think, Patrick's premise, if I may, was why not have a top liberal arts college in Africa? I mean, the number of people over the years that I've heard that have said to me, oh, well, that's Harvard and we can't do Harvard here because we're in country X. I think Patrick's example is, well, no, you can. You just have to have the vision, the grit to try it and do it.
Sebastian Thrun said yesterday that we're nowhere ready for the kind of skills that we need and that's required at the pace at which technology is moving. Do you think that enough is being done to equip people in terms of their skills?
Well, I mean, I think there's work. Clearly, there's work to be done. Personally, I don't 100% buy the skills gap story. I think to a certain extent, it's companies wanting to shift the responsibility onto the public education system to train people for work. Well, they should be doing, quite frankly, some of that and a lot of that. Education has to be more than just about skills and jobs. I mean, I appreciate Patrick's call to arms to say, well, yeah, we need to educate entrepreneurs. And I agree, but if you look at the education of top entrepreneurs, a lot of them are educated in the arts. A lot of them are educated in creative activities. A lot of them have a sort of a moral compass, an ethical compass. And I think that we need to get back to that holistic view of education, which is not just about, jobs.
Chimamanda, you work with a lot of aspiring young writers. How do you help them reach their full potential?
I just want to add to
Yeah,
what,
of course.
which is to say that I couldn't agree more, that I think it really is important to think about education as not just learning skills, but learning such things as citizenship, and even more importantly, empathy. And I think one way to do that is to make sure that literature is an essential part of education. I think literature teaches you empathy. Literature forces empathy on you. Literature makes you think about living in somebody else's skin. And if one is able to do that, I think, then we're more able to live peacefully with one another. We're more able to understand that people are different and that it's okay. I think that's what the storytelling for me is such an essential part of what it means to be educated. I often joke about how I really didn't want to go to school. I just wanted to stay home and read books. And I think I might have been better off if I'd been allowed to do that. But I teach workshops in Nigeria, and I started it about 10 years ago because I had the good fortune to be published, and I knew that there was a lot of talent in Nigeria, not so much opportunity. I knew that there were young people who wanted to write, and I knew that mine was a society that didn't necessarily think of writing as something that was aspirational. And so I started this workshop to bring people together who cared about the same things and to say to them, it's not strange to want to read and write. And I think there's something that's quite beautiful about knowing that you're not alone and knowing that somebody else has done what you want to do. And So for me, that was why I started the workshop. It's grown, and we have so many applications now. I had wanted it to be focused on Nigeria, but to be Pan-African. Now we have applications from all over the world, and it's still mostly Nigerian, kind of getting Pan-African. But for me, at the core, it's about helping young writers to know that they can write and to find their voices, whatever their voices are. And I'm also hoping that it becomes sort of a stepping stone for greater diversity in African literature. So we have people who are interested in fantasy and science fiction and creative nonfiction and all of those things. And it's incredible to me the amount of talent there is. The people who come to that workshop and they write a piece, and I am just completely blown away. And what happens after the workshop is that there is a community that's created of people who continue to support one another. And so now and I think what happens is that it feeds itself. So they send each other their work, they critique each other, and they've gone on to do things. Some of them have published books, they're in writing programs, and it's, for me, something that I feel very excited about. And I also learn. What I love about teaching is that I learn as I teach.
You've touched a few times about this kind of cultural attitude towards writing and literature. Is that starting to shift though now? Are you starting to see a change where parents are okay to support their children who don't want to be engineers or doctors, they want to be writers?
Not as much as I would like. I suppose there is a slight shift, but I wish there was more. I think there's a shift when it comes to maybe music in Nigeria, and I think that's because Nigerian parents have seen that musicians actually earn money. So it's shifting a little bit with writing, but not as much as. But also, I think it's fair to be fair to the parents. It's not so much about killing their children's dreams as it is about realizing that their children have to earn a living, and Nigeria is still a country where you can't really earn your living from writing, at least not writing literature. So you would need to teach or have some sort of backup, which is also okay, I think.
Stavros, in the last 2 days, we've spoken a lot about fact and truth. And really, this is the basis of education. Are you worried that it's now being rattled because of this post-truth world that we're living in?
Well, if I can just piggyback a little bit
Sure.
on what Chimamanda was saying, and Sir Michael Barber, who was here yesterday, he said something interesting during a lunch with Her Highness, that he says, the debate on education is plagued by false dichotomies, meaning that it really isn't about skills versus knowledge or arts versus science. It really should be about both. And at the core, I think we need scientists who are sensitized to the humanities, and we need humanities scholars who are scientifically literate. So it's not an either or. In terms of the post-truth issue, I see it more as a call to arms. I think let's not spend any more time navel gazing and asking ourselves, oh, how did we get here? Let's focus instead on what we need to do going forward. And I think if we assert the ethical values on which a good education is founded, then I think we're going to be all right. Key value is respect for the substantiated truth, the primacy of fact over opinion. But it also is about acknowledging that the search for the truth often involves competing ideas. And the best way that we resolve that competition of ideas is through reasoned discourse and through listening to each other.
I'm curious, Chimamanda, because we are now grappling with this whole idea of a post-truth world, and fact is no longer fact, or how we view it. Actually, you can come up with your own facts. Is this something that you grapple with your young students as well?
No, not really. Because I think that might be something that is particular to a particular set of people in a particular country who talk about alternative facts. I think, but I think maybe the larger point really is how to talk about what's happening, and I'm not as I love that about navel gazing. So I'm not as interested in the navel gazing and how do we get there. I think just to teach young people that they should. I think in general, whether or not we're in the post-truth world, that it's a good thing to have a certain kind of healthy skepticism about things, and not to be gullible. And I think particularly now in the sort of the age of social media, that I think education should include a certain kind of literacy in social media. Because social media is not all bad, right? Well, debatably. But really, so my parents have recently become WhatsApp users. My father is 85, my mother is 75. And they have recently become WhatsApp users and email users on their phones. And it's delightful to watch because they're still trying to figure out what things are. But what I found was that they believe everything that they see. And so when you're sort of sending an email or you're online looking at something and there's one of those ads that says, click here, you have won $1,000. My parents are often quite marveled by this, and they think, really? Now let's see what that's about, and they click. And I realized that they come from a generation that isn't literate about these things, and also come from a generation that expects a certain kind of ethical approach, and so they don't understand why anybody would put that in if it wasn't true. and so I think having a certain kind of skepticism, questioning, just teaching young people to ask questions. And also, I mean, fact over opinion, yes, but I think to blend both, to say to them, it's very important to be able to forge opinions, but those opinions need to be based on the foundation of fact and truth, right? You don't pull an opinion out of the air and say, well, it's my opinion. You have to be able to reason it out. And that idea of sort of intellectual rigor, even when you're giving an opinion, I think those are important skills to teach people. And I say this again, it really doesn't matter to me that there's a country where there's a leader who doesn't seem to know that fact is fact.
Stavros, we've just talked there about having literacy when it comes to using social media, but actually a lot of studies have found that young people are not literate when it comes to these things, whether they're, highly educated or not.
No, that's right, and I think one of the biggest problems we have is that we have sort of been persuaded by the high-tech industry, dare I say, that technology is neutral, that the platforms, the social media platforms, the search engines are neutral, and I think that is an alternative fact, shall we say. They're not neutral. Their ethical choices are being made in the design of these technologies, or they're not being made, perhaps. The choices are not being made. And for example, when a search engine gives a hierarchy of results based not on what is objectively speaking most valuable to you to answer your question, but based on what it thinks you want to hear or want to read. That's a choice that's being made, and it's being made by the algorithm. Similarly with our Facebook feeds, when Facebook pumps information based on, again, what it thinks we want to see, not on what may objectively be or not be useful. That's, again, a design choice that's being made. I'm not suggesting here that there's anything sinister going on in terms of these choices, but I think people design these things to sell to us, fundamentally. And then those engines are now being used to promote, quite frankly, bad ideas. And I think we need to not just educate ourselves, definitely have to do that, but I think we need to demand of our tech giants to take on some editorial responsibility. I'm not advocating here for control of information or censorship, but I think they need to exercise editorial responsibility in the same way that a quality newspaper and a quality channel has to exercise editorial responsibility, because they're not neutral.
Indeed.
I mean, one thing would be, for example, for newspaper websites to stop doing the recommended for you. So if you've read 2 stories about gun violence, the next time you go on there, they recommend 7 stories about gun violence. And I'm thinking, I actually want to read other things. And I think that this age of the targeted ad, the targeted news article, it limits us. And there's a sense in which it's a wonderful thing to open a newspaper and read a story that you might not have read, because it widens your perspective. And I think that what's happening in this age of social media, although we talk a lot about social media connecting us, and actually I worry that it's limiting us, that we're all, sometimes without even knowing it, we are retreating into our own little safe spaces where we read only the things we want to read. And that, in terms of education, is not necessarily a good thing.
Well, on that note, I will open up the floor again to questions. So we've got number 4, 1, and 2. So with number 4, please.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Riaz. I'm from Next Generation. My question is little different. I'm attending this WISE conference for 5 years now, and we are talking about quality education, learning for underprivileged. And I'm thinking, for those who are well educated, well privileged, and they are on leadership role, and they are just busy in distracting this world, what do we do about it?
And number 1, please.
Hi, my name is Maimouna. I'm young.
Could you stand up, please?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
My name is Maimouna, and I'm on the WISE Young Learners Program. I am so thrilled that Chimamanda is here. I'm a huge fan of your work. Ever since I've been young, I've found it difficult to relate to a lot of mainstream literature. And for the first time, we have somebody talking about race, representation, identity, and I applaud the WISE community for bringing you here. We always talk about technology and science progressing education and how important technology and science are for the future generations. But in honor of Chimamanda being here, I want to suggest that perhaps we also need arts and literature to heal. I say that because I did my master's on ISIS and extremism, and I would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions on how to regain a generation of young Muslims in Britain, Asia, and Africa who have fallen prey to extremism and radicalization. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe it was number 2, that was the next question.
Hello, good evening. We've been talking about digital education. So there's an OECD research which says that the access to education, digital education. So the way we use internet is very different, and it comes to a point where people, especially young people belonging to different classes, use internet very differently. For example, someone belonging to an upper middle class would use internet very differently, and someone belonging to a lower class would use internet very differently. So this was a very interesting OECD research. I wish to ask whether we can address this inequity in technology when it comes to education.
Thank you. So one of the questions was about how do you regain a generation that's lost? She had done her studies on young people joining ISIS. So I don't know if you had thoughts on that.
I wish I knew how. I wish I knew how. I do think it might not be the answer, but I think that there are a number of things that might help. And so for Muslims in Europe in particular, where Islam has really taken on the role of a maligned race. And I think that it might be helpful to think about making European Muslims feel that they are in fact a part of Europe. I think that when people feel, excluded, that it's easy to turn to something else, right? And I think it's true that many countries in Europe have, in subtle and not so subtle ways, made Muslims feel that they are not, in fact, a part of their community, of their societies. And I know I keep going back to reading, but I can't help it because I'm such a believer in the power of stories. I think maybe also it's not just education, it's the type of education. I mean, when we talk about education, I'm enthusiastic about education, but I'm also very interested in asking what type of education. I know many ostensibly educated people who I do not find interesting in the least bit. And I know people who are not conventionally educated, who are in fact intellectually curious, wide readers. I also think that it matters what you're taught in school. It's not just that you're taught addition and subtraction. It's also, what are you taught to value? What are you taught about yourself? If you're growing up in a continent like Africa, you're taught, for example, that your history begins when the Europeans came. I remember in primary school being taught that the river Niger, which runs across the region of Nigeria from where I come, was discovered by a European called Mungo Park. And I think I was maybe 9 or 10, but even then I found this ridiculous. Because I remember thinking, surely my great-grandfather, sort of fished in the river Niger before this person came. And so when you're told these stories about your own history and you internalize them, what really you're learning is to diminish yourself, to diminish the contribution of your own people to your own history. And the reason that I find that very worrisome is that it affects everything. If you carry that worldview into the world, it affects the things that you think you can do and cannot do, right? Because I think there's an emotional component to education. Right? And so for me, it's a question of what are we teaching? What are we teaching kids? What are they internalizing? Right? There is a way, I think, to teach a certain kind of sense in which you are not a passive participant in your own story. You are an active participant. And I think the way that history is taught to many Africans still makes Africans passive. And I think it's dangerous. And it's not just Africa. I think this is true for Asia. I think this is true for the Middle East. I think this is true for Latin America. And I think it's important to change that because by changing that, we empower young people to feel confident enough to take on things. And I sort of want to tie this back to the idea of extremism, which is to say that you can educate people in a way to make them less likely to be gullible to extremism.
Great.
Again, if I can just come in here, I think we need to start making a distinction between schooling and education. So schooling is, you've gone through the system, you've acquired a set of qualifications, you may or may not be able to do certain things, right? So let's take an example. You've gone to a top business school and you've earned yourself an MBA. You're well schooled. But if you also believe that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, I would like to humbly suggest that maybe your education has some gaps in it.
On that note, can we please thank our remarkable speakers? Unfortunately, we've run out of time and we can't take any more questions, but please thank them for their contribution. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So that really now brings to an end the WISE Summit, but if I can please ask Stavros to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you. Your Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we've now arrived at the close of WISE 2017. In what has been a challenging year, your presence here means a great deal to us. Thank you. And as I wrote to you back in June, it's a testament to the fact that Qatar remains very much open to the world. We've spent an exhilarating and inspiring couple of days together, discussing how education is the key to building a conscientious society that values knowledge and not only keeps up with technology, but actually drives and shapes it ethically. As Her Highness said yesterday morning, and I'm not nearly as eloquent as she is, let us be inspired by this year's WISE theme of coexistence and place it at the core of solutions for different challenges, from issues of peace to stability and development. Let us return to education to reinforce this truth. As always, at the summit, we had the opportunity to engage with one another in solutions-based networking sessions. We had a new feature in the Majlis this year, where we harnessed our collective intelligence to map out our ideas for the future of schools. This is a question that is at the heart of Qatar Foundation's considerations today, so we thank you for your contributions. Now, many of you who participated are currently in school, and this is reflected in the diversity of insights and contributions, and I just want to share a couple of examples. The question was, what does a school that unlocks creativity look like? One answer we got was completely different from our school. I think we may have to revisit the question of whether we allow high schoolers into WISE, but I'll let that one slide. To the question, who are the teachers at a school that unlocks creativity? A more thoughtful answer this time was, those who focus on talent and embrace failure. I think these answers and the hundreds more that we receive speak to the need for us to continue rethinking and reinventing education. And this is essentially the essence of what WISE is about. This year, we also took the summit beyond the walls of the QNCC. During what we call the Doha Learning Week, we partnered with 25 local and international organizations who between them hosted 40 events, from hackathons to film screenings to concerts for the entire community. And I want to thank all of those organizations that participated in Doha Learning Week. Our pre-summit program on November 14th included a day-long workshop at the Qatar Foundation headquarters, which brought together over 60 organizations to continue a conversation that began in April in Washington on ways to strengthen the global education ecosystem. We also hosted a workshop run by Qatar's Ministry of Education at the magnificent new Qatar National Library. Now, it's worth repeating that WISE may have begun life as a forum in 2009, but today it's much more than that. Our work rests on three pillars: research, programs, and advocacy. And increasingly, these pillars interconnect and reinforce each other. Earlier this morning, WISE launched the Agile Leaders of Learning Innovation Network, all in. What began as a capacity-building program then grew into a research agenda, and today we're ready to take the next step. We're ready to go all in and enable and empower a global network of school leaders. WISE is also, thank you. WISE is also contributing to the global policy agenda through its work with APEC on setting an education strategy for the Asia-Pacific region. Your Highness, you should know that WISE is one of 3 external advisors that APEC has invited on this work. The other 2 are the OECD and the World Bank. We're also working with the MasterCard Foundation to look at secondary education in Africa. Beyond research, in just 3 short years and with the generous support of Banco Santander, the WISE Accelerator has established itself as a small but nevertheless influential player in the education technology space. Participating projects have reported significant growth in both users and revenues. And while we have still much to learn in this space, going forward, we want to implement and provide targeted impact studies to support not only these new entrepreneurs to assess the effectiveness of their learning technologies, but also to gain new understanding and build new knowledge of this important space. So again, our programs are supporting our research, which in turn support our programs, and so on and so forth. And I'm pleased to announce that Banco Santander has agreed to renew its support to the WISE Accelerator for a further 3 years. So we thank them for that. I'm also pleased to announce that WISE will join forces with our sister organization, the World Innovation Summit for Health, WISH, to launch joint research and programs on well-being. And I do want to encourage all of you to watch out for the announcement of WISH 2018 in the coming weeks. I feel like I should be handing some sort of flag or Olympic flame now to Sultana, but none have been provided, unfortunately. Now, to continue advocating our advocacy work, to continue advocating for quality education as a means of individual empowerment and social transformation, WISE is launching a podcast, which we have very cleverly titled Wise Words, and which will feature in-depth conversations on education with leading public intellectuals, innovators, artists, and educators. The first episodes are already available on SoundCloud and will soon be available on iTunes as well. Now, finally, in the past 18 months, WISE took its message of hope to Tunis, Beijing, and Madrid. The success of these WISE at regional forums has prompted us to institutionalize this format. So I'm happy to let everyone know that in May 2018, we will team up with our outstanding and inspirational laureate to bring you WISE at Accra. But we're not going to stop there. In September, we will be in New York for WISE at the United Nations General Assembly. And in March, we will take WISE to Paris before returning to Doha, to our home, in November 2019 for WISE 2019. Your Highness, you've started something very special here. You have something very special here. Your work, your vision to build a future where quality education is a fundamental right available to all continues to inspire us. All of us at WISE feel privileged to be a part of this. Thank you.
Stavros, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stavros. That brings us to an end of WISE 2017. The call for applications for the WISE 2018 award is now online on the WISE website. I'd like to thank you all for a wonderful 2 days. A special word of thanks to Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, and Thank you so much, and see you again at the next WISE.